He was a weary veteran walking home from a long shift, when a faint cry broke the evening air. By the roadside, a German shepherd, paw trapped in rusted metal, eyes filled with pain, yet hope. Mark freed the dog, and from that moment, they were inseparable. But here's the question. Why did this dog, with a rusted military tag on his collar, keep pulling him into the forest? And what secret lay hidden behind vines and fallen trees, waiting for decades to be uncovered? What Mark and his new friend Hunter found would stir old memories, awaken a town, and remind us of the quiet miracles born from loyalty, faith, and second chances. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more K9 stories of courage and redemption. The late summer air in Montana carried the weight of change. The hills rolled in quiet golden waves, trees already hinting at autumn, with a scatter of red and amber leaves. The sky glowed with a pale orange dusk, and the forest at the edge of town stood dark and silent, like a wall keeping secrets. In that stillness, a man walked with heavy boots, his stride steady, but marked by the faintest limp. Mark Johnson was 45 years old, a veteran of Iraq. His body bore the visible evidence of survival, broad shoulders hardened by labor, skin weathered by sun, and a scar beneath his shirt that ran jagged across his right shoulder. Shrapnel had torn through muscle years ago, and though surgeons had patched the damage, pain returned whenever the seasons shifted. He moved like a man who had learned to pace himself, each step deliberate, as though he carried weight not visible to others. His face carried both resilience and fatigue. Hazel hair, once bright with youth, had dulled to an earthy tone, streaked silver at the temples. A thin beard, equally mixed with color and gray, clung to his jawline. His eyes, gray-green and deep-set, had the tired sharpness of someone who never fully rested. They often looked past people rather than at them, scanning the environment as though expecting danger to rise from nowhere. The habit was old, impossible to break. Mark's world since returning from war was narrow. By day he worked at a lumber mill on the outskirts of town, where the scent of pine resin and sawdust mixed with the roar of machines. The work was hard and monotonous, lifting, cutting, stacking. But he endured it with silent determination. The men respected his strength, yet noticed his distance. He smiled politely when they joked, nodded when they shared stories of wives and children, but rarely joined in. For them, the mill was a job. For Mark, it was survival, a way to keep food on the table and rent paid for his small room above a gas station. That room was as spare as a barrack, a bed tucked into one corner, a single chair, a battered dresser. His boots were lined neatly by the door, shirts folded with soldierly precision. But the order only amplified the emptiness. There were no photographs on the walls, no ornaments, nothing that tethered him to a larger life. The silence pressed in each evening, broken only by the creak of old pipes or the distant hum of trucks on the highway. PTSD was the shadow he could not shake. Nights were the worst. Dreams carried him back to Iraq. The blinding heat, the acrid smoke, the thunder of mortar fire. He often woke drenched in sweat, fists clenched as though still gripping a rifle. Sometimes he paced the small room for hours, unable to calm the racing in his chest. At the mill, the sudden crack of splitting wood sometimes dragged him back in memory to the sound of explosions. He never explained these moments to anyone. He simply gritted his teeth and waited for them to pass. But the deepest wound was not the shrapnel or the nightmares. It was Rex, his K9 partner in Iraq, a sable German shepherd with eyes that burned amber in the desert sun. Rex had been more than a dog. He had been a comrade, a guardian, a friend who could sense danger before men could. Mark remembered the subtle stiffening of Rex's body before an IED was discovered, the steady bark that warned of hidden threats. They trusted each other with their lives. When Rex died during an ambush, leaping ahead to draw fire away from the squad, Mark had cradled him in his arms, whispering promises he could not keep. The memory of that final whimper haunted him more than any battlefield noise. In quiet moments, Mark still reached out unconsciously, expecting Rex's solid presence beside him. Instead, his hand met only empty air. Rex's death was the unspoken reason Mark never tried to replace him with another pet. It was also the reason Mark hesitated at the thought of building a family. He had once dreamed of marriage, of children playing in a yard, of laughter spilling through a house at the edge of the woods. But Whenever he allowed himself to imagine it, fear followed. Fear that his PTSD would cast shadows over those he loved. Fear that sleepless nights, sudden rages, or long silences would drive them away. Fear that he might fail them the way he believed he had failed Rex. So, Mark chose solitude. Better to remain alone than risk bringing harm or sorrow to others. Better to keep his pain contained than let it spread. He told himself it was protection, though in truth it was also resignation. On this evening, leaving the mill, Mark rubbed his sore shoulder as the men waved goodbye. He nodded back, but did not linger. He preferred the quiet of the walk home. The gravel road wound past the forest, where pine shadows stretched long and the air cooled with every step. He carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, inside only a change of shirt, his lunch tin, and a flask of water. The sun lowered, painting the horizon in streaks of violet and gold. A few leaves drifted down, brushed by the wind. Mark paused for a moment, watching them fall. The scene was beautiful, but it tugged at him with melancholy. In another life, perhaps, he would have built a porch here, watched children chase each other under the trees, laughed with a wife by his side. In another life, perhaps Rex would have lain at his feet, ears pricked, content. But that life had belonged to someone else, someone untouched by war. Mark exhaled slowly, pressing the ache deeper down. He resumed walking, boots crunching on the gravel. The forest loomed, dark but familiar. He liked its silence. It reminded him that even scars could blend into the landscape if one was still enough. Yet, as he walked, the longing he tried to bury stirred again. He wanted someone to talk to without rehearsing his words. He wanted to share a meal without silence swallowing it whole. He wanted to sit beside another living soul and believe, if only for a moment, that he was more than the sum of his wounds. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the woods. Mark stopped. His chest tightened at the sound, a reflex he could not control. For an instant, he thought of Rex, alert, steady, loyal. He closed his eyes, let the sound echo, and then forced himself forward again. He did not know that soon another German shepherd would cross his path. He did not know that this time fate would not take but give. For now, he was still the lost soldier, trudging home beneath the fading light, unaware that destiny waited just beyond the tree line. The evening had fallen cool and quiet, the kind of Montana dusk where every sound carried across the valley. Mark's boots ground into the gravel road as he left the lumber mill, shoulders aching from lifting planks, the scar on his right side throbbing with each step. He was tired, hungry, and ready for silence. Yet, as he walked the stretch of road where the forest pressed close, a sound broke through the rhythm of crickets and wind, a faint whimper, almost swallowed by the leaves. He slowed, ears pricked like the soldier he once was. Years of training had left him wary of every unusual noise. He turned toward the ditch running parallel to the road, and there, half hidden in tall weeds, was the source. A German shepherd, caught and struggling. Its hind paw was wedged inside the twisted frame of rusted iron, perhaps part of an old fence post abandoned decades ago. The dog whimpered again, eyes locked on him. Amber eyes, intelligent and alive, with pain and hope in equal measure. Mark crouched down carefully, ignoring the sharp protest of his injured shoulder. He spoke softly, his voice low, almost instinctively slipping back into the cadence he once used with Rex on the battlefield. "Easy now, hold still." The shepherd did not snap or bare its teeth. Instead, it froze, as if recognizing something in his tone. Its ears twitched, its tail gave a single uncertain wag. The frame was stubborn with rust, jagged at the edges. Mark braced his boots, leaned in, and with a grunt bent the metal just enough. The dog yelped as the paw slipped free, then sagged against the ground, breathing heavily but not panicked. When Mark reached out to examine the injury, the dog allowed it. No serious damage, just cuts, bruises, and the beginnings of swelling. That was when he saw the collar, worn leather, cracked with age, and a brass tag dulled by time. He rubbed the dirt off with his thumb and read aloud. Hunter. Beneath the name, a series of numbers in the same format he remembered from military tags. His breath caught. What would a dog with a military tag be doing here? Half-starved, paw caught in scrap metal? Hunter, he repeated. The shepherd's ears perked at its name. tongue flicking out once as if in answer. Mark swallowed hard. Something inside him shifted. The same mix of pain and recognition that came whenever he thought of Rex. But unlike Rex, this one was alive, right here, staring up at him with steady amber eyes. Mark straightened and gestured. "Come on then." The dog rose shakily, limping on the sore leg, but followed without hesitation. The long walk back to his rented room above the gas station became different that night. Every few steps the shepherd looked up, tail swishing faintly, as if checking that Mark was still there. And for the first time in years, Mark did not feel entirely alone on the road. The climb up the narrow stairs to his room was clumsy, but Hunter managed. Inside, the space was small, neat, but empty. Boots by the door, a bed, a chair, a battered dresser. Hunter sniffed cautiously around, then circled twice and lay down by the bed as if he had always belonged there. Mark pulled out his small first aid kit and began cleaning the paw. The dog winced but did not pull away, lying still with the patience of an animal that had known discipline. When he was done, Mark sat back heavily. He had little to offer, half a tin of leftover stew and some bread, but he slid the plate toward the dog anyway. Hunter ate without greed, finishing slowly, then lifted his head to rest it briefly against Mark's knee. The gesture nearly undid him. He pressed a hand into the shepherd's fur and felt warmth he had missed for far too long. That night, for the first time in months, he slept without waking in terror. Each time he stirred, he heard the soft sound of Hunter's breathing at the foot of the bed, and it anchored him. The nightmares still came, but they did not drag him fully under. At the mill the next day, one of his co-workers, Bill, a stout man with gray whiskers and a belly that strained his suspenders, grunted when Mark walked past. "You look less like a ghost today," he said, half teasing, half curious. Mark only shrugged, unwilling to explain, but inside he knew the truth. The presence of one dog had done what years of silence and labor could not. By the end of the week, Hunter's limp had eased. Mark had bought cheap dog food from the small convenience store downstairs, sacrificing part of his wages without hesitation. Each evening when he returned, Hunter was there, waiting, tail thumping against the floor. They began walking together after work, short loops around the edge of the forest. The shepherd's discipline showed. He kept pace without pulling, ears alert, eyes scanning the woods. It was during these walks that Mark noticed something. More than once Hunter would stop and stare into the trees, ears forward, body tense. At first Mark thought it was deer or small game, but sometimes the dog would whine softly, glance back at him, and then return its gaze to the same shadowed direction. It was not random. It felt deliberate, like the shepherd knew there was something beyond the tree line worth finding. Mark dismissed it at first. "Not tonight," he muttered one evening, tugging gently at the leash he had bought. But Hunter persisted. Every morning before Mark left for the mill, he would find the shepherd sitting by the window, head turned toward the forest, eyes fixed and unblinking. The sight unsettled him. It was as though the dog carried knowledge he did not. In quieter moments, Mark sat with his thoughts. He found himself speaking aloud, telling Hunter things he had never said to another human. He admitted he was afraid of starting a family, afraid his PTSD would poison any chance of happiness. He admitted he still heard Rex's last whimper in his dreams. Hunter listened, head tilted, ears flicking as if every word mattered. The bond between them grew quickly, dangerously so. Mark had sworn never to replace Rex, never to risk that loss again. Yet here he was, running a hand through Hunter's thick coat, feeling the solid weight of him curled at his feet, and realizing the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack. And then there was the tag, the numbers etched beneath Hunter's name. Each time Mark touched it, questions pressed harder. Why military format? Where had Hunter come from? And why, every time they walked near the woods, did the shepherd try to lead him deeper? For now, he told himself he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew. Dogs rarely lied, and this one carried secrets. Secrets that would not stay hidden forever. The days slipped into early autumn, the Montana air turning crisp, mornings cooler with mists settling low over the hills. Leaves fell in thicker numbers, painting the gravel roads in copper and gold. For Mark Johnson, the rhythm of life had shifted since Hunter entered it. Work at the lumber mill was still grueling, The scar on his shoulder still ached, but the evenings held a new ritual. Walks with the German shepherd, the sound of paws on gravel softening the edges of his solitude. Yet something about those walks unsettled him. More and more, Hunter's attention seemed fixed on the forest beyond the road. The shepherd would pause mid-stride, ears pricked, amber eyes locked on a patch of shadow beneath the trees. Sometimes it whined, sometimes it tugged lightly at his sleeve or the edge of his jacket, urging him toward the tree line. At first, Mark brushed it off as instinct. Dogs chase scents after all. But this was different. Hunter did not lunge or bark wildly. It waited, patient, insistent, glancing between Mark and the forest as if trying to communicate a purpose. One Saturday morning, when he was free from the mill, Mark decided to test his suspicion. He clipped the leash and let Hunter lead. The shepherd trotted with focus, nose high, ears forward, pulling him along paths he rarely walked. They crossed behind the gas station, down a slope where weeds grew tall, and into a narrow game trail threading between fir trees. Hunter's limp was long gone, its gait confident, almost eager. Mark's heart pounded as branches brushed his shoulders. He had avoided the deep woods since returning home. The quiet reminded him too much of patrols gone wrong overseas. Yet with Hunter striding ahead, he felt less fear and more curiosity. After an hour, he called it off. The trail grew dense, blocked by fallen trees, and his shoulder burned from the climb. He tugged gently at the leash. Enough for today. Hunter stopped, whined softly, then obeyed. That obedience, so sharp and immediate, only deepened Mark's unease. This was not a stray wandering dog. Hunter was trained in ways that matched too closely the discipline Rex once showed. The brass tag with military numbers gnawed at him like a puzzle left unsolved. That evening, he mentioned it to Bill at the mill. Bill was a man of 60, his gray whiskers bristling around a square jaw, his frame thick with decades of labor. He had the kind of voice that rumbled like gravel, blunt and often skeptical. Over lunch, Mark said quietly, "The dog, sometimes it feels like he's trying to take me somewhere in the forest." Bill snorted, stabbing his fork into a piece of ham. "Dogs'll do that. Probably smelled a deer carcass or a coyote den. You're reading too much into it." He eyed Mark, then added in a lower tone, "Don't let your head play tricks on you. War already did enough of that." Mark clenched his jaw but said nothing more. Bill meant no harm, but his words pressed on this sore spot of PTSD. Still, even if he wanted to dismiss it, the thought lingered. Hunter wasn't just sniffing at random. Something deliberate was pulling him. The following week, Mark began to notice smaller details. Each morning, before he left for the mill, he found Hunter at the window of the small room, staring out at the forest, tail still, ears stiff. In the evenings, when Mark returned, the shepherd often sat by the door, as though waiting not just for him, but for the moment it could try again to lead him. Sometimes, during their walks, Hunter would stop, turn his head, and emit a quiet bark, low and steady. Not alarm, not play, something in between, like a reminder. Inside, Mark wrestled with the possibilities. Part of him wanted to ignore it. Life had only just begun to feel less hollow. He feared that following Hunter's strange urging would unravel the fragile balance he had found. But another part of him, long dormant, flickered with something dangerously close to excitement. He had lived too many years trudging through days without purpose. Could it be that this dog, this stranger he had rescued from rusted metal, was offering him something more than companionship? One rainy evening, as he dried off from the walk, a memory hit him. Rex, ears pricked, staring into the dark alley in Fallujah, body stiff, waiting for Mark's command. Back then, following Rex's instincts had saved lives. He swallowed hard, running a hand down Hunter's back. The shepherd pressed closer, amber eyes shining with an intensity that seemed almost knowing. The signs could no longer be dismissed. Mark felt it in his bones, the same way he once trusted the unspoken language of a K9 partner. Hunter wanted to show him something. And though fear lingered, curiosity had begun to outweigh it. Saturday dawned crisp, the Montana sky clear and endless, the horizon washed in the golden haze of late summer tilting into fall. A cool breeze drifted through the pines, carrying the earthy smell of damp soil and fallen leaves. Mark Johnson rose earlier than usual, pulling on his beige shirt, worn jeans, and brown work boots. His scarred shoulder ached faintly from the week's labor, but today, unlike the monotonous days at the mill, carried a strange kind of anticipation. He had promised himself and Hunter a walk into the forest, not just for wood and wild herbs, but to see where the dog might finally lead him. Hunter was already restless, tail sweeping the floor, amber eyes alive with energy. His tan and black coat gleamed in the morning light, ears pricked, every muscle alert as though he understood this day was different. When Mark clipped the leash, Hunter gave a soft bark and trotted ahead, almost dragging him down the gravel path behind the gas station. They entered the woods where the air grew cooler, shaded by the canopy overhead. Leaves of orange and yellow fluttered with each gust of wind, falling around them like sparks of fading summer. The sound of their footsteps and paws crunching over leaves echoed faintly in the stillness. For the first time in years, Mark felt something close to peace. The woods had once unsettled him, too close to the patrol silence of Iraq, but Hunter's presence transformed them. The dog moved like a guide, confident, weaving through narrow trails as though retracing steps long forgotten. Mark carried a small hatchet strapped to his pack, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder to gather herbs. He paused when he spotted wild yarrow growing in a cluster, its white blossoms standing bright against the forest floor. Kneeling, he clipped a few stems, tucking them into his bag. "For the aches," he muttered, half to himself, half to Hunter, who sniffed curiously at the plants. Not as good as the pills, but cheaper. Hunter barked once, tail wagging as though approving. Mark chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "Guess you think I should take better care of myself, huh?" He shook his head. Talking aloud to the shepherd no longer felt strange. Hunter listened with an attentiveness most people lacked, tilting his head at every shift in tone, offering companionship without judgment. Deeper in the woods, they crossed a creek, water trickling clear over stones. Hunter leaped across easily, landing with a grace that reminded Mark of trained precision. He followed more slowly, boots slipping on the slick rock, and nearly lost his balance. "Show off," he grunted, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The forest opened briefly into a clearing where sunlight spilled warm and golden. A doe lifted her head from the underbrush, ears twitching, before bounding away with her fawn. Hunter stiffened, but did not chase, only watching, muscles taut. Mark noticed the restraint and whistled low. Not many dogs would let that one go. "You're different." His eyes lingered on the brass tag glinting faintly at Hunter's collar. Different indeed. They pressed on. Hunter grew more insistent as the path narrowed, pulling gently at the leash, then stopping to look back at Mark with a whine. Mark sighed, brushing sweat from his brow. "You're leading me somewhere, aren't you?" The dog's tail wagged once, decisively. For a moment, Mark let himself enjoy the absurdity of it. A man who had spent years drowning in silence was now following the subtle insistence of a dog through the Montana woods. Yet, beneath the humor, a seed of something serious grew. Trust. Hunter had saved him from the emptiness of his nights. Maybe now it was time to see where the dog wanted to go. The trail bent upward, overgrown but not impassable. Fallen trees lay across parts of the path, their trunks softened with moss and vines. The scent of pine thickened, and shafts of sunlight filtered down through high branches, painting the ground in shifting gold. Mark paused to catch his breath, leaning on the hatchet. His shoulder throbbed from the climb, but strangely, the pain seemed lighter when he looked at Hunter bounding just ahead, glancing back to make sure he followed. At one point, they passed an old hunting stand, a wooden platform nailed high into a tree, half rotted, forgotten by whoever built it. The sight made Mark think of another man from town, Carl Benson, a wiry, sun-weathered hunter who often visited the mill to trade stories. Carl, with his weather-beaten cap and his perpetual cigarette dangling from cracked lips, had once told Mark that parts of these woods held old ghosts from the Cold War. Mark had laughed it off then, assuming Carl's whiskey loosened his tongue. But now, following Hunter deeper into the wilderness, those words drifted back uneasily. They rested at a small rise where the view stretched further across the valley. Mark sat on a fallen log, unwrapping a simple lunch of bread and cheese, dividing it evenly. Hunter ate his share quickly, then settled at Mark's feet, ears swiveling constantly, nose twitching at scents beyond his reach. Mark leaned back, watching the shifting canopy above. The peace of the moment reminded him of afternoons long ago, when Rex would sit pressed against his leg during downtime, overseas. For a flicker of a second, He let himself imagine Rex and Hunter, side by side, two guardians in different chapters of his life. As they rose to continue, Hunter pulled harder toward the deeper woods, past the comfortable range of Mark's usual wanderings. Mark hesitated, feeling the edge of unease return. His breath caught at the sight of the thickening growth ahead. Vines tangled over a mound of stone and earth, a shape almost too symmetrical to be natural. He narrowed his eyes, but the sun shifted and the impression vanished back into shadow. He shook his head, unwilling to let his imagination run. Too far. Not yet. Another day, he murmured, tugging the leash gently. Hunter resisted with a soft growl, but finally yielded, tail lowering. Mark ruffled the fur behind its ears, heart heavier than he expected. He didn't know why turning back felt like delaying something important, but it did. The walk home was quieter. The sun dipped lower, painting the trees in amber light. Mark talked more than usual on the way back, recounting stories from the mill, muttering complaints about his aching shoulder, even humming a tune half-remembered from the youth. Hunter listened, as always, his eyes never straying far from the forest shadows behind them. For Mark, the weekend walk was more than gathering wood and herbs. It was a reminder that, perhaps, he was not as alone as he once thought. And though he had not yet followed Hunter all the way to wherever the dog wanted to go, curiosity had rooted deep in his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time. The forest was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. Mark had followed Hunter deeper than ever before, his boots crunching over a carpet of yellowing leaves, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered down in fragmented shafts, painting the ground in patches of gold. Hunter trotted ahead with unmistakable purpose, tail high, ears alert, occasionally glancing back to make sure Mark was still behind. They had been walking for over an hour, leaving behind even the faintest hint of game trails. Mark's shoulder throbbed, but the curiosity growing inside him outweighed the ache. He had told himself he would stop if things felt unsafe, but each time he considered turning back, Hunter's steady amber gaze urged him forward. Finally, the dog stopped. They had reached a massive fallen tree, its trunk covered in moss, its roots twisted and thick, like the skeletal fingers of something ancient clawing at the soil. Vines wound tightly around the roots, their tendrils tangled with wild shrubs. Hunter sniffed at the base, barked once, and then sat back on his haunches, staring at Mark expectantly. Mark frowned, stepping closer. The air was cooler here, unnaturally so, as if something beneath the earth exhaled a different breath. He brushed aside some vines and froze. Beneath the layers of growth, a surface too smooth to be natural revealed itself. Concrete, poured thick and weathered gray, streaked with moss. His pulse quickened. He hacked away at the vines with the edge of his hatchet, each swing releasing damp fragments of greenery. As the tangle fell away, a shape emerged. A door. Not just a hatch or small opening, but a massive steel door, tall enough for trucks to pass through, rust flaking along its edges. Its hinges were broad, built to withstand decades. The surrounding wall of concrete stretched far in either direction, swallowed by earth and roots, as though the forest itself had been trying for years to erase it. "A bunker," Mark whispered, breath fogging in the cool air. He pressed his palm against the steel, feeling the cold bite through his skin. The weight of history seemed to hum beneath his touch. Hunter barked softly, tail swishing, as though confirming his discovery. It took effort, but Mark found a side lever embedded in rust. With a grunt and all his strength, he pulled. The door groaned, metal screeching against age, and then, with a reluctant shudder, it opened just enough for a man and dog to slip through. Dust poured out like smoke, the scent of iron, oil, and decay mingling. Inside, the air was musty, yet preserved in a strange way, sealed tight enough to keep the outside at bay. Mark flicked on the small flashlight from his pack. The beam pierced the gloom, revealing a cavernous space. He stepped forward cautiously. Rows of rusted cages stretched along one wall, their bars bent and corroded. Old wooden obstacle frames stood in. Collapse, remnants of training courses for dogs. A faded mural of a German shepherd painted on concrete loomed near the entrance, its once bright colors muted by time. Hunter padded beside him, nose twitching, tail low but not fearful. The shepherd's calm steadied Mark as he moved deeper. They passed into what had once been a medical room. Cabinets lined with broken glass displayed instruments dulled with rust. Shelves held crumbling bottles and yellowed gauze. On a central table lay a ledger, its pages warped but still legible. Mark opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, dated in precise rows. 1944, 1951, 1963. Notes detailed the conditioning, health, and training regimens of K-9 units spanning from World War II into the Cold War. His throat tightened as he turned a page and found a black and white photograph paper-clipped to the margin. It showed a handler in fatigues kneeling beside a German shepherd, the dog's ears high, its eyes alert. Behind them, in the background, he saw obstacle courses identical to those crumbling around him now. Mark swallowed hard, emotions warring inside him. Nostalgia, grief, wonder. It was as though he had stepped into a mausoleum of his own memories, yet older, layered with generations of handlers and dogs before him. In a far corner of the bunker, a wall bore pinned photographs in rows. Handlers and their dogs, faces proud, sometimes weary, some smiling despite the gravity of their work. Beneath each, faded notes identified units, dates, even names. His flashlight paused on one image, a soldier with stern eyes, holding a dog whose face reminded him eerily of Hunter. The resemblance was uncanny, the same amber eyes staring out across decades. Mark lowered the light, fighting the lump in his throat. He realized this place had once been more than a training facility. It had been a home for partnerships like his with Rex, a sacred space of loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. Hunter pressed against his leg as though sensing his turmoil. Mark knelt, running a hand over the shepherd's head. "This is where you were leading me," he murmured. The dog leaned into his touch, steady and patient. As they explored further, Mark noticed details that painted a fuller picture. A faded medical chart recorded rehabilitation of injured dogs, complete with sketches of braces and exercise routines. A small infirmary area suggested that these animals weren't only trained, but cared for with devotion. There were even notebooks filled with observations about behavior and bonding, how handlers wrote about their companions as partners rather than tools. The silence was immense, yet not oppressive. For the first time in years, Mark felt connected not just to his own past, but to something larger, a lineage of men and dogs who had carried burdens together through history. Eventually, he sat on a cracked bench, the flashlight resting on his knee, Hunter lying at his feet. His mind swirled with questions. Why had this place been abandoned? What stories had been lost here? But underneath the questions was something simpler, more profound. For the first time in years, he felt less like a man drifting and more like a man who had found an anchor. Hunter yawned, laid his head on his paws, and closed his eyes, as though satisfied that Mark had finally seen what needed to be seen. Mark leaned back, the faint sound of wind pressing against the steel door outside. He exhaled deeply. The bunker was no longer just concrete and rust. It was memory, sacrifice, and a reminder that he was not as alone as he believed. The beam of Mark's flashlight flickered across cracked walls and dust-heavy air, slicing through shadows that had lain undisturbed for decades. Hunter padded beside him with quiet certainty, ears swiveling at faint echoes. Mark's breath echoed in his chest as if the bunker itself inhaled with him. He had seen ruins before, villages in Iraq, buildings hollowed out by bombs, but this was different. This place was heavy with memory rather than destruction. He aimed the light at a corkboard nailed crookedly to the wall. Rows of black and white photographs stared back. Men in fatigues, their shoulders squared, their hands resting on the backs of German shepherds. The handlers' faces varied, stern, proud, sometimes weary. But the eyes of the dogs never wavered, steady, loyal, alive. The images spanned decades, yet the gaze was always the same. Mark's throat tightened. He stepped closer, dust billowing as his fingers brushed against one photo. A young soldier grinned faintly at the camera, freckles visible even in the faded print, his arm wrapped firmly around his shepherd. Mark imagined the kid's voice, laughter carried in some distant barracks. Beneath the photo, a scribbled note remained legible. For bravery in Normandy, 1944. K-9 Rex, never forgotten. The name hit like a hammer. Rex, his own dog years ago, had shared the same name. The coincidence broke something inside him. He pressed his lips together, jaw clenched, but his eyes stung. Hunter gave a soft whine, pressing his flank against Mark's knee. His fur was warm, grounding, a reminder that the loyalty in those photographs wasn't gone. It still breathed beside him. Mark forced himself onward, light sweeping the corners of the room. A narrow shelf sagged beneath the weight of binders and notebooks. He pulled one free, the leather cracked and brittle. It smelled of dust and old ink. He flipped it open carefully, revealing pages written in neat cursive. The first entry was dated 1943. To all who may find this, remember our four-legged soldiers. They do not question orders, nor do they complain of hunger or fear. They give everything, even their lives, for the men they follow. They deserve to be remembered not as tools, but as comrades. Mark's hand trembled. The words blurred as memory surged back. Sandstorms, gunfire, and Rex lunging forward into danger without hesitation. He remembered the sound when Rex didn't come back. He had buried it for years, but here, in this bunker, it clawed free. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold concrete floor. His chest heaved, and for a long moment, he let himself grieve. Hunter padded forward, tail low, and rested his head gently on Mark's thigh. The dog's amber eyes glimmered in the flashlight's glow, holding no judgment, only presence. Mark laid a hand on the shepherd's head, fingers curling into the thick fur. "I thought I was done carrying this," he whispered, hoarsely. "But maybe I was just waiting for you." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something deeper, as though the souls of every dog and handler that had once trained here still lingered, listening. The beam of light shifted again, catching on another binder, this one stamped with a faded insignia, an eagle clutching crossed rifles. Mark tugged it down. Inside were lists, names of dogs, serial numbers, notes on missions. Some pages carried small clippings of fur taped beside the entries, tiny memorials for each animal. He read aloud, "Max, Scout, Pacific Theater, 1945, died in action." His voice cracked. He turned another page. "Shadow, Tracker, Korea, 1952, survived 3 tours, retired." Each entry was a life, and each life was bound to a man like him. Mark shut the binder gently, reverently. He rose, moving toward a steel cabinet rusted nearly shut. After forcing the latch, he revealed rows of medals pinned carefully inside, awards given to dogs, bronze stars, service ribbons, certificates, some framed, others loose. He lifted one certificate, its edges yellowed. "In recognition of valor, K9 Duke saved the lives of 6 men by detecting an ambush." Mark swallowed. He thought of the mill, the paycheck that barely covered rent, the way people looked at him as though he had failed. And yet here, surrounded by these testaments, he felt something shift inside. He hadn't failed. He was part of something larger, a brotherhood that stretched across generations. Hunter's bark startled him. The dog had nosed open a smaller door off to the side. Inside was a cramped office, a desk cluttered with papers. Mark entered, sweeping the flashlight across the space. On the desk lay a journal, its cover embossed with a faint insignia of the U.S. Army K9 Corps. He opened it and read, "If you are reading this, you walk among ghosts. Remember them. Tell their story when the world forgets. Without them, many of us would not have come home." The words stabbed deep. Mark pressed the journal against his chest, closing his eyes. He could almost hear Rex panting beside him, almost smell the desert sand, almost feel the weight of a harness tugging at his arm. A sound echoed, a low creak. Mark stiffened, knife instinctively drawn from his belt, but it was only the shifting of rusted metal as the bunker settled. He exhaled, sheathing the blade. Still, the adrenaline reminded him that he was alive, present, standing on the shoulders of all who had come before. Hunter circled once before lying at his feet. Mark sat down heavily, opening the journal again. This time, he whispered the words aloud, letting them fill the air, giving voice to the men and dogs who could no longer speak. When he finished, the silence was profound. He looked down at Hunter, whose eyes glimmered back with something almost human. "You brought me here," Mark said softly. "You showed me I'm not alone. Not then, not now. Hunter thumped his tail once, as though in agreement. Mark knew, in that moment, that this bunker was more than relic and ruin. It was a sanctuary, a sacred ground where loyalty still breathed. Hunter had not just found him, he had led him back to the memory of comrades lost and to the truth that even the forgotten could be remembered again. Mark had never thought of himself as a man who could change the course of anything beyond the swing of his hammer at the mill. But standing at the edge of the forest, the bunker looming behind him like a shadow pulled from the past, he realized the truth was too big to keep hidden. That night, he barely slept, turning over in his mind the photos, the journals, and the medals. The weight of history felt heavier than the weight of his own scars. Hunter lay curled against him, steady breaths offering a reminder that loyalty was still alive. The next morning, he walked into town. His stride carried an urgency he hadn't felt in years. His beige shirt clung to his back with the heat. Boots dusted from the trail, his frame solid though, lined by years of labor. People noticed him more than usual, nodding as he passed. Perhaps it was the set of his jaw, or the steadiness in his eyes. At the town hall, Mark requested an audience with the mayor, Eleanor Briggs. She was in her early 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with chestnut hair streaked silver and kept in a neat bun. Her glasses framed sharp hazel eyes, and her manner was brisk, practical. The product of years balancing politics with small-town gossip. Yet there was a compassion beneath her sternness, shown in the soft lines around her mouth. She had lost a brother in Vietnam, and though she rarely spoke of it, it shaped the way she listened to veterans. Mark explained everything. At first his words stumbled, caught between the disbelief of what he'd seen and the fear of sounding unhinged. But Eleanor leaned forward, hands clasped on her desk, nodding as he described the photographs, the journals, the insignias. When he showed her the binder he had brought back, her expression shifted from doubt to astonishment. "This," she said softly, running her fingers over the faded cover, "isn't just history, it's sacred." Within days, the news spread. Local papers printed headlines about the forgotten K9 bunker in the Montana woods. Reporters came with cameras slung over their shoulders, their jeans and plaid shirts dusty from the forest paths. One of them, a young journalist named Kevin Hartley, stood out. Slim, mid-20s, with sandy hair that fell into his eyes, Kevin carried a notebook like an extension of his hand. His questions were careful, almost reverent. He had grown up with a father who trained police dogs, and there was an earnestness in the way he listened to Mark that felt different from the others. Soon, veterans began to arrive. Old men with canes, others in wheelchairs pushed by their children, some with medals pinned crookedly to faded jackets. They came with stories of their own K9 partners, dogs named Max, Duke, Shadow. Tears welled in eyes weathered by decades as they stepped into the bunker for the first time, touching the cages, the photos, the ledgers. One man, James O'Rourke, bald and stooped at 78, broke down entirely when he found the name of his old dog scrawled in the records. "Ranger," he whispered, fingers trembling. "He saved me more than once." Mark stood beside him quietly. Hunter pressed close against his leg. The respect in James's eyes when he turned to Mark felt like sunlight after years of storm. The town rallied. Volunteers, students, carpenters, and veterans alike helped clear the vines and debris. They scrubbed the rust where they could, erected protective fencing, and hung temporary lights. The bunker, once hidden and silent, began to breathe again with voices and footsteps. The State Historical Society sent representatives. A middle-aged archivist named Margaret Levine, short with kind eyes and graying curls, declared the site a unique Cold War-era facility with World War II lineage, invaluable for both cultural and military history. Plans formed to preserve it as an official historical landmark. But beyond the papers and plaques, something deeper shifted. People who had once walked past Mark without a second glance now stopped him in town. At the diner, men offered to buy him coffee. At the mill, Joe Miller, the young co-worker who often teased, slapped his back with a grin and muttered, "Didn't think you had it in you, old man." It was said with respect, not mockery. At night, Mark sat on the porch of his small rental cabin. Hunter sprawled at his feet, listening to the crickets. Visitors sometimes came by just to hear him talk, about the bunker, about Rex, about the bond between soldier and dog. For the first time in years, people didn't look at him as a broken veteran or a man living in shadows. They looked at him as a keeper of memory, a bridge between past and present. Hunter, as always, was part of it. Children who came to see the bunker often ended up crouching by the shepherd, scratching his ears. Hunter tolerated the attention with quiet dignity, occasionally glancing back at Mark as if to say, "This is good. You needed this." Mark felt it too. For years he had thought he was just surviving, one day bleeding into the next. But now he had purpose. Not the kind forged by war, but the kind built by remembrance and community. And though he still carried scars, they felt lighter, softened by gratitude and the steady companionship of the dog who had found him when he was most lost. For the first time in a long time, Mark believed he belonged. The days that followed the recognition of the bunker blurred into a season of change, and for the first time in decades, Mark Johnson found himself at the center of something larger than survival. Autumn painted Montana in rich colors, fiery maples, golden aspens, and the deep green of stubborn pines. The air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, but to Mark, it felt alive, invigorating. With community funds and a grant from the state, Mark was given a modest cabin near the edge of the forest, not far from where the bunker entrance slumbered beneath vines and roots. The house wasn't grand: 2 bedrooms, a porch with peeling paint, and a wood stove that rattled when it burned too hot. But it was his. After years of rent and transience, of living in spaces that never felt like home, this place anchored him. On the first afternoon, he sat on the porch, beige shirt rolled at the sleeves, brown boots planted firm on the steps. His posture was upright, his frame solid, but his expression softer than it had been in years. Beside him, Hunter sprawled lazily, paws outstretched, nose twitching at every leaf that tumbled on the breeze. The shepherd's coat caught the afternoon light, making him look almost regal, a guardian content in his post. Neighbors began to drop by. Children came first, their laughter scattering across the yard as they ran up to Hunter. He tolerated their tugging hands with patient dignity, offering the occasional tail wag or gentle nudge of his muzzle. A boy named Tommy, no more than 8, with freckles and missing front teeth, knelt in the grass and whispered, "You're a hero, aren't you?" Mark watched Hunter lean forward, licking the boy's cheek, and his chest warmed with pride he hadn't felt in years. Elders came too, men with caps embroidered with Vietnam veteran or Korea 1950 stitched across the brim, their steps slower, but their eyes bright as they spoke of dogs they once served with. One man, Harold Grant, 83, broad-shouldered though bent with arthritis, had a grip like iron when he shook Mark's hand. His voice rasped from years of smoking, but it carried a resonance when he said, "You did right by bringing that place into the light. Too many of us thought no one cared anymore." His words stayed with Mark long after Harold left. On Sunday afternoons, women from the local church brought casseroles and pies, insisting Mark needed to put some meat back on those bones. One of them, Margaret Levine, the archivist who had once cataloged the bunker's artifacts, often stayed to share tea on the porch. Short, with her graying curls and gentle humor, she asked thoughtful questions about Rex and the war, listening with the patience of someone who valued memory more than answers. Though Mark had grown wary of opening up, he found himself telling her stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The bunker itself became a place of pilgrimage. School groups visited, wide-eyed as guides, explained how dogs once trained to save lives. Reporters returned, not for sensational headlines, but for follow-up features on the veteran who gave his town its history back. Some even sought interviews with Mark personally. At first he resisted, awkward under the camera's gaze. But Kevin Hartley, the young journalist with sandy hair and honest eyes, persuaded him. Kevin's writing was tender, focused less on spectacle and more on the bond between man and dog. "People need to hear your story, Mark," Kevin said once, his notebook balanced on his knee. "Not because it's dramatic, but because it's human." Mark didn't feel like a hero, but slowly he accepted that maybe he had done something worthwhile. In the evenings when visitors drifted home and silence fell, Mark found peace on his porch. The sound of owls echoed in the distance, and the scent of pine mingled with wood smoke from his stove. Hunter would rest his head on Mark's boot, amber eyes watching the tree line. Sometimes Mark spoke aloud, about his fears, about Rex, about the strange path that had brought him here. And though the shepherd gave no answers, his quiet presence was answer enough. One evening, Tommy returned with his mother, a young widow named Claire Whitmore, tall and willowy, with auburn hair tied back and eyes the color of clear lake water. She carried herself with a mix of resilience and fatigue. Her late husband had served overseas, and though she rarely spoke of it, grief lingered in the way she held her son close. She thanked Mark for letting Tommy visit, her smile tentative but genuine. Mark, usually tongue-tied around strangers, found himself at ease. They spoke of simple things, the forest trails, the stubborn chill of Montana winters, the courage of children and dogs. Hunter, sensing something delicate, lay still at Mark's feet, ears perked but calm. For the first time, Mark wondered if life still had room for new bonds, maybe even love. The thought scared him, the weight of PTSD and fear of hurting someone lingering like shadows. But as Claire laughed softly at one of his stories about the mill, the possibility no longer felt impossible. Weeks passed, leaves turned from gold to brittle brown, carpeting the forest floor. The bunker was officially declared a historic site, with plans to preserve it for generations. Mark was asked to cut the ribbon at the ceremony. Standing before a crowd of townsfolk, veterans, and children, he spoke simply. His voice was rough but steady. "This place doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every man and dog who served, and to every person willing to remember. Hunter just showed me the way." Applause thundered. Mark looked down at Hunter, who wagged his tail once, solemn as if he understood. That evening, back on his porch, Mark leaned into the fading light. He wasn't rich, not in money, but he had something better, a home, a community, respect, and a companion who had led him from darkness into light. For a man who once believed he had nothing left, it was more than enough. And so, as autumn surrendered to winter, Mark found what he had sought all along, not salvation in wealth or war, but peace in belonging. When we look back at Mark's journey, it was never just about a hidden bunker or the relics of forgotten wars. It was about a man once broken by loss who, with the quiet guidance of a loyal dog, found his way back to hope, to community, and to the meaning of belonging. Hunter did more than lead Mark to a door of rusted steel. He led him to open the locked places in his heart. The truth is, miracles rarely come with thunder or fire. They come in small moments of faith, a child's laughter, an old friend's memory, a neighbor's kindness, or the steady eyes of a dog who refuses to leave your side. Just as Mark discovered, we too can find light when we choose to walk forward, even in the shadows. Perhaps this is God's way, reminding us that He works not only in grand gestures, but in everyday blessings. And if Mark's story teaches us anything, it is that no one is ever truly forgotten, and no one is ever truly alone. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and love. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment, subscribe for more, and carry hope into your own life.